Hi, good day everybody. My name is Logan Williams. I'm the Conservation Manager for Coral World Ocean and Reef Initiative Inc. or CWORI, which is located at Coral World Ocean Park. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I should have added the VI CDAC logo on here, but I am also a part of the Virgin Islands Coral Disease Advisory Committee. Today we're going to talk about collection and ex-situ treatment of SCTLD infected corals. So just a brief, overview of the presentation. I'm going to give you guys a really general introduction, talk about some of the resources that would be needed. I feel a lot of this stuff has been mentioned already in the previous presentations, but this is basically the process that we went through to come to this point. Selecting target corals for ex-situ treatment, how we go about doing that, so the procedures and protocols for our rescue process in the territory, some lessons that we've learned, and then future actions and directions. All right, so very brief background. So the coral rescue program wasn't initially included in the disease response plan for the territory, but it was something that we all really wanted to get involved with, but it really was lack of funding, resources, personnel, infrastructure, everything like that. So at the time, we were in the epidemic phase of the outbreak, and so we were seeing mass mortality on all these reefs, and it was devastating, as you all know. And so one of our intervention strategies, in-water intervention strategies at the time, was to basically remove corals that were infected with disease to reduce that disease load. So these corals were removed, and then they were disposed of in a safe manner. And unfortunately, we were, like I said, we were disposing of them because we just didn't have the capacity to care for them or, attempt any type of ex-situ treatment. However, we did start moving in that direction and basically started experimenting with these ex-situ treatment trials at the University of the Virgin Islands, which were successful. Were successful, and so then we reached out. Or we basically referenced our amoxicillin water dosing methods on the Miller et al. 2020 paper, which you can see up there in the top right-hand corner, and started testing that at the University of the Virgin Islands. And also, I was working at Coral World at the time. Now I work for the nonprofit, but we were basically, at least for us at Coral World, we were just kind of basically treating corals in buckets at that point. So it was extremely experimental, but we did have success. And so we decided we wanted to continue to pursue this type of work. So this was kind of my personal goal, but in our VI, Virgin Islands Coral Disease Response Plan, we do have some alternative goals as well, additional goals, I should say. And so basically it's to mitigate population declines and to preserve the biodiversity of SCTLD affected species in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I would also like to clarify that this presentation is more geared towards their epidemic phase of the disease. We are now in the endemic phase, so some of these, methods have changed a little bit, and we've also, received some resources to really expand this work and invest in some infrastructure. And our selected approach to coral rescue was to remove small disease colonies and disease fragments from larger susceptible species from the field, bring them into a laboratory facility or ex-situ nursery facility, and then treat them. And then to basically retain those corals throughout the rehabilitation process, and then basically pursue asexual and sexual propagation work for future restoration activities. Okay, so the resources that you need, I would say this is probably the most important because I was kind of doing this not on my own, but it was very few of us doing this work in the beginning. So personnel is very important. You need to have an experienced field team, experienced divers who have been trained in this type of work, and ideally coral biologists or field ecologists who have a history working with coral health and disease. And then for your land-based team, you're going to want to have a coral health and disease scientist or researcher, aquarists that have experience in coral husbandry. And I would say that's probably for me, at least, that would be the most important type of person you'd want on your team, because I'm not an Aquarius. I don't have a background in coral husbandry work. And so it's been a really interesting learning experience to go through this process. And then if you are able to obtain a veterinarian who works specifically with corals and understands them, that's ideal. However, a coral scientist with training in wildlife pathology or veterinary medicine and or epidemiology, I would say is just as qualified for that position. Okay, and then of course you need your life support system. So you're going to have your treatment and isolation system. Like I said, this is all very rudimentary. Anybody can basically do this, and it's a very cost-effective way to treat corals. Like I said, we are in the process of constructing a more, investing in a more advanced water dosing system at my facility. But you need treatment aquaria and containers basically to dose those corals with the antibiotics that you choose. And you need, areas in those tanks, or if you have small aquaria that are connected to an inflow outflow with the ability to have an open and closed system, that would be ideal. And then you have your general holding tank, and this all depends on whether you have your facilities indoors or outdoor, right? We personally have a land-based nursery facility that is located outdoors, and we do have a flow-through system, and so each individual tank is hooked up to its own UV sterilizer to prevent pathogens from being introduced. And you want to have large and medium-sized aquaria as your permanent holding system to house those healthy corals, or the rehabilitated corals, I should say, and then a quarantine system as well for flare-ups and basically for corals that have gone through the treatment and isolation process, and now they need to be moved into quarantine before they can put into that larger coral holding system. Okay, so in field work, you need a vessel if you're going to be collecting corals from offshore sites, but if you have a shore site that is your restoration site, you can drive there, dive in the water, collect your corals, and transport them in coolers or buckets by a vehicle. For collection, you're going to want to have hammers, chisels. We use resealable plastic bags that are 1 to 2 gallons volume to basically place our corals in throughout the transport process. And those bags are labeled. I actually like to label the bags personally. If I'm tagging a larger colony and I am, expecting to remove, for example, a pillar from a Dendrogyrocylindrax coral, I'll bring a cattle tag, put that in the bag, label the bag, and then you just have that, chain of command, which coral is which. But if you're out in the field and you have these bags and you're planning on labeling anything, you can always just take a piece of waterproof paper, cut it up, and then put it in each bag, and then, write down that unique colony ID, basically, when you collect that coral. And then, so that's labeling supplies, cameras, and dive slates for documentation. I personally just use a camera. I photo document everything, but if you dive slate, of course, if you want to do that old school way. And then nylon, mesh, or catch bags to put your corals that are in your plastic bag in there for transport to the surface. And then you're going to need to have access to medication, critical care, and treatment. So amoxicillin, on the right, that's veterinary grade amoxicillin. The left, that's actually just fish amoxicillin that you can purchase online. It is more granulated, so I would suggest grinding it up into a powder if you're going to go down that route. And then for topical treatments, we use amoxicillin, 1-to-8 ratio of amoxicillin to base B. Base B is that the topical ointment that was created by ocean alchemists to treat corals in situ, but it works really well for spot treatments in land-based facilities as well. We also use various different coral dips, and we're experimenting with some other stuff. So Lugol's iodine, that's basically your go-to if you're going to be removing a diseased coral from the field. That's a great antiseptic. We also use Frag Recover. I feel like it's a less intense, stressful coral dip. So if you're bringing in corals with active lesions and you're in the epidemic phase of this disease, I would use Lugolzadine, but frag recover is an alternative option. And then for ciliate infections, we've started testing this non-alcoholic clove extract. But like I said, you guys have been in this field for a long time. Most of you are probably Aquarius, and you have your go-to, antiseptic coral dips that you use. And so this is just the type of stuff that we've been working with. And then obviously coral saws for amputations. For smaller pieces, it's better. I personally think it's better to use, Griffin diamond blade bandsaw. Causes less stress to the coral, but if you're bringing in really large pieces, and that are extremely dense and don't fit in the saw, then you're going to need like a tile saw or chop saw or some other method to remove that lesion. And then this is something that we kind of figured out. It was trial and error, I should say. Feeding corals is really, really, really important. And I guess I just didn't I didn't think about that in the time. We had a food system, so we didn't think we needed to feed them, but that has become a part of our basically like treatment protocol. Like the corals get fed on a daily basis. All right, so now what are good candidates for this type of rescue? Basically, you want to target highly susceptible or vulnerable species, susceptible species, species that are vulnerable to further population declines or potentially becoming functionally extinct on your reefs. And you want to, and if you see like disease corals of opportunity, you would want to select those as well, because there's a potential they could be spreading that infectious agent as they're if they roll around on the reef. And we were targeting basically corals that could fit inside the bag that you were able to seal shut. So 30 centimeters max diameter, but basically anything that can fit inside that 1 to 2 gallon bag. And then at the time we were definitely targeting, when we're removing parts of a larger diseased individual, you're going to target like that apparently healthy tissue that's on there. So that would be for fragments. And now I'm just going to go into the coral collection. So these are the protocols that we follow out at CWORI. So basically, when you get to your site, you find your target coral, right? You photograph that target coral. You photograph that labeled bag or the paper that's in the bag with that unique coral ID. The way we label our corals is we'll put down the site code, the species code. If you're tagging the coral, whatever cattle tag number that is, or just some random number, and then whether it's a colony, so that would be like an NA, or if it's a fragment, and then you give it a letter. So in that, it would be an A or B, etc. So for colony removal, basically, you're going to take your hammer and your chisel, and you're going to lightly tap underneath that coral until it pops off the substrate, and then quickly place it in your bag, zip that bag shut, photograph it, and then place it in that catch bag, that nylon or mesh catch bag that you're going to use to transport those corals back to the surface. And for removing, specifically for Dendrogyra, if you find a larger colony that clearly can't fit inside that bag and has, multiple lesions, it's a pretty severe case of disease. If it's possible, try to remove only healthy tissue, healthy looking tissue, or apparently healthy tissue. And, the furthest away from the disease margin or lesion interface is best, but at least 2 centimeters into that apparently healthy tissue. And when you're removing it with a hammer and chisel, you don't need to whack it off. You just kind of lightly tap it. It takes a little bit of skill and practice, but, we've been able to do that pretty successfully in the past. And then if you're removing living tissue from a larger colony, you want to photograph that colony after you remove that living tissue. All right, so you put your corals that are in your plastic bags in the mesh bag, transport them to the surface. You can use lift bags to help with that ascension, because sometimes the corals can become very heavy. And once you get to the surface, hopefully you have a team that's on the vessel already ready to go. They see your bubbles coming up and they're starting to add that fresh water into those containers. So we were using coolers originally, but I really like, we've kind of completely transitioned to using large 5 gallon food safe buckets that you can screw, that have screwable lids on them. They're really easy to carry and they're easy to store. We just prefer them over the larger coolers, but obviously if you're going out there and you're rescuing like 100 corals, you know, you're probably going to want to have some type of larger container to transport those. So those coolers are filled up with fresh water immediately. You're going to conduct a water change with your coral and then keep it in the same bag, reseal it. And for some smaller fragments, what we've noticed is if you don't fill the entire bag up with seawater, it creates a bubble basically at the top, and it kind of floats around and protects the coral from banging into other corals or into the edges of the bucket. But also bubble wrap, which was stated earlier in the session, can be used to protect these corals as well during transport. And then you cover, well, like I said, we've been using these resealable buckets. So we'll take the lid, screw it on, and then place in the shade for transport. And then I didn't include this in here, but I have in previous presentations, anything more than an hour or 2 hours, you know, you're probably going to want to bring either portable bubblers, individual containers, so that the coral's not sitting in that bag for more than an hour. That's going to cause a lot of stress. And then you're going to transport those corals. For us, at least in the Virgin Islands, we're not traveling very offshore. It's really pretty quick transport to our land-based facility, which is located on the coast. So we don't do coral processing or amputations or anything like that on the vessel. We wait till we get back to shore to do that. So, but you know, it is you can completely do coral processing work and amputations on the vessel. Okay, so you transfer your corals back to your land-based nursery facility, and ideally you would like to have your coral husbandry staff there ready to go with all the material that you need to start this basically amputation and treatment process. So you bring the coral in, you're going to amputate it, so you remove that, you know, infectious material, and then we automatically transfer that coral into Lugol's iodine solution, so 0.5 Lugol's iodine solution. Basically, it's 40 drops of Lugol's iodine for every gallon of seawater. And we let that sit for about 15 minutes. And we'll either use like turkey basers or pipettes. And if you have small power heads, that's even better. And you're just, you know, trying to get rid of that extra, you know, excess skeletal material and mucus and all that stuff that you want to remove from the coral. Once the coral is completed, it's dip. Actually, I should say at the same time, you should have staff there already collecting this data. What is the unique ID of the coral? What process, like, did it undergo an amputation? Was it just coral processing where you're removing just, you know, extra skeletal material? And then the size of the coral, the health of the coral when it was brought in, health after processing, or however you would like to collect your data, that would be a great time to do it. And then, you know, you want to label your attachment pieces, so your coral plugs or your tiles. We don't use coral plugs anymore, and this is a very, very small coral that we removed. So we've been working with larger Dendrogyra actually more recently, but we like to use these CWORI tiles, and they look really nice, and the corals have, you know, they do really well on them, and so that's what I'm going to start using in the future. But at the time, we were using homemade concrete plugs that we had made. All right, so the coral's gone through its dip. You have this data, and you're going to want to soak that coral or rinse it at least in sterilized fresh seawater to remove that residue from the Lugol's iodine. And we do that for about 3 minutes before we transfer it over to for its amoxicillin dosing regimen. And then, of course, you want to photograph coral before amputations and after amputations. Okay, so like I said, this was adapted from that Miller 2020 report where they were using ampicillin instead of amoxicillin, but we had, at the time, we had a lot of amoxicillin. We didn't have that much base to be. So we were being very conservative with our in-water treatments, and we were only targeting larger individual colonies. So we were, like I said, we were seeing a lot, mass mortality in these smaller colonies of these highly susceptible and rare species. So that was why we started experimenting with some amoxicillin. And basically the dosing procedure goes, you're going to add the amoxicillin to those treatment containers or aquaria, and it's going to be 100 milligrams of amoxicillin for every liter of seawater. And you want to make sure that coral's not cramped in that container, right? It's got, there's enough water, there's enough volume in there for the coral to not become stressed. And you're going to wait for that amoxicillin powder to dissolve into the water before you place your coral in there. And then the coral will remain in that treatment container for about 24 hours. It will receive, well, initially we were just doing 100% water changes because we weren't feeding them, but I've changed this a little bit. So they stay in there for 24 hours. Then they get 100% water change. 50% of that water comes from a healthy holding tank with the same species in the attempt to kind of try to replenish that, beneficial bacteria that we know has been disrupted and lost, potentially disrupted and lost because of the amoxicillin treatment. And then we feed them, and then we do another water change, and then dose them again. And this process just continues for 10 consecutive days. After 10 consecutive days, you're assessing your corals this whole time, but especially on day 10, you're going to take a really good look at all your corals. If the lesions have halted or the coral is completely healthy, it looks like it's healthy, then it's going to progress to its isolation period. And basically what that is, it's going to remain in its treatment aquaria. No amoxicillin or anything like that, just fresh sterilized seawater in a closed system. Or if you're using buckets, you'd be doing water changes, right? And ideally you want to do that for about 2 weeks. But that varies depending on the protocols in your institution. And then once that coral has gone through that isolation phase, no disease has appeared, it's going to proceed to its quarantine period, which is at least 30 days, but 30 to 60 days is more ideal. And then during quarantine, you're going to want to continue those health assessments because you want to catch disease if it reappears. But even if only one coral starts to get a reinfection and all the other ones look okay, they still have to undergo that quarantine process all over again. All right, so just really quickly, I'm going to wrap this up. I'd say the biggest thing that I've learned in this entire process is nutrition. Nutrition is so important. Amputations and nutrition. I feel like, I mean, we brought diseased Dendrogyra in. It wasn't during the epidemic. It was moving towards the endemic phase of the disease. The lesions weren't acute, they're more subacute, but amputation and feeding them and just making sure that, you're keeping up with these really important basic coral husbandry requirements that are species specific. We've noticed that they did not get any new infection and they were completely fine. So I would say that just making sure that environment is conducive to survival and health for this coral is the most important. Amoxicillin dosing is a great tool, I think, that you can have and use when you need to. And it can be used, to help out with that disease response during the early phases of the epidemic. And if a coral does not respond well to the dosing, right, then you should remove it. And you should just kind of try to take care of it with, like I said, feed it, make sure it's clean and has adequate water flow and all that type of good stuff. And then just really, really quick, and I know I'm over time. Basically, our future actions for VI-CDAC is to develop and implement a plan for coral rescue. For a coral rescue program for species significantly impacted by SCTLD, to develop and implement an SOP for infected coral rescue and treatment in land-based facilities, and to evaluate the effectiveness of rescue and rehabilitation back to the reef for healthy and susceptible reef builders. And that's it from me. So thank you.